Genesis chapter 6 is where we've gotten to. Genesis chapter 6. We've been in this series, which I'm loving, really. Honestly, I've been able to look at these chapters more deeply than I have in the past. As you know, I planned when we started to just do an Old Testament survey class, kind of like I had in seminary, and it would be relatively quick, and we'd go over, outline every book, and it would move through the whole thing in a couple of months. But I got into Genesis 1 and was like, goodness, there's a lot more I want to do. So we're not doing like sermon type series where we do a few verses at a time, but at the very least, we're going to do a chapter a night. Tonight, we're going to do chapters 6 through 10 at least, and maybe chapter 11, depending on how fast we get there. We talked about how Genesis 1 through 11 is noticeably different than the rest of Genesis, and that's agreed upon by everybody, regardless of your view on how to understand those chapters. Genesis 1 through 11 is different. Meaning in chapter 12, we're introduced to Abraham, and when chapter 12 begins, it is clearly, literally, and the way we understand history in the 21st century, go baby, that Genesis 12 starts what we think of as history, meaning it tells us what happened in the chronological order that it happened. But 1 to 11, everyone agrees is at least in some way different. And so there's a lot of disagreement about how to understand these things and what parts should we see as chronological history, what parts are meant as more mytho-history, which is a genre. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that it's aimed at teaching us truths as opposed to giving us chronological stories. There's a lot of different options there about how to understand those. So I want to try to get through chapter 11 if possible tonight, but if not, we'll at least get through chapter 10 because 6 through 10 is all the same story, which is the story of the flood. But I want to see some of the big themes that we have here in these chapters. As opposed to looking at each chapter, we see some of the themes repeating in each chapter. And the first one, maybe clearly, is God's judgment on evil. Okay, so remember, of course, Genesis 3 and 4, or 3, sin comes into the world. The promise for Christ is already given in chapter 3. And by chapter 4, we have murder, so it gets going pretty quickly. And then chapter 5, we're told the results of sin, where this guy dies, and this guy dies, and then it's death after death after death, because the wages of sin is death. Chapter 6, we realize the further progress of sin, where we have the whole world is corrupt in some sense, and God is going to judge evil, which of course is a theme from beginning to end of the Bible. And for the first time, we really see it clearly in Genesis 6. For the first time, we see the promise clearly that evil will not go untouched, that evil will not go unjudged, that God will do what is right and will judge rightfully but wrathfully evil that deserves that kind of judgment. There's a few things in these chapters. Chapter 6, we've talked a little bit about the Nephilim. And if you want to ask about that later, I can tell you what I think about it, but I'm not going to do it now because it's not all that relevant to the topic at hand. But chapter 6 starts the story of the flood and this promises of God to punish, to bring judgment down on the evil world. Verse 5, if you got your Bible, Genesis 6, verse 5. The Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's a major statement of evil, right? That every intention of their heart was evil continually. And the Lord was sorry he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man, animals, creeping things, birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is also another first where we have what's referred to as divine accommodation, meaning some versions, your version may say that God repented at creating man, or he regretted creating man. And if you think about God for 5 seconds, there's some difficulties there, right? What do you mean God regretted? Obviously, he knew this was going to happen at the very least and all these things. So this idea of, and we get this from beginning to end of the Bible, of divine accommodations, what is often called, or even the anthropomorphism of God, is to make God, to give him sort of human emotions to communicate to us something about God, right? So it's not literally that God regretted or that he wished he hadn't have done it, because obviously he knew it was going to happen from the beginning, but that the point of the Bible, right? The reason that this book exists is not because God needs it, it's because we need it, right? So there's going to be times in the Bible where it's here for us to understand things a certain way, even though it's not to be literally understood that way. So it's not literally that God regretted it in the human sense of regret, right? Or wished he hadn't done it in the human sense of that. But it is that God wants us to know that God was grieved in some real sense about what the world had become. right? So it's communicating some emotional complexity of God to us in terms that we understand. It is the divine accommodating to our understanding of things, to our finite minds. Like if you stepped into Narnia, to C.S. Lewis's Narnia, and you used things in Narnia to help them understand something about the outside world, even though they couldn't understand it fully. It's the same thing as here, that God steps in, writes his word to us, and there's going to be times where he uses things for us, our understanding, that may not fit with the idea of God bigly, sovereignly, the huge God that he is. And this is the first kind of example of that, where we have this idea of wishing he hadn't made humans, which, for all those things we talked about, is illogical in itself, but makes sense to what we're talking about. So yeah, we have it's called divine accommodation, it's called anthropomorphism, it's called pictorial language, it's called all kind of things. But it's that God is wanting to communicate to us something about himself. And just like we have in humanity, we talked about this before, how complex your emotions can be. Right? When a father walks a bride down the aisle, how complex those emotions are, right? It's really hard to explain what you're feeling. Is it joy? Yeah. Is it mourning? Yeah. Are you happy? Yeah. Are you dreading it? Yeah. I mean, it's so much there. And God too is so much more infinitely complex than we are, that surely there's some emotional complexity would be hard for us, if not impossible for us to understand. So we have passages in the Bible that says, well, it's kind of like this. Like you think of it like regret. It's not exactly regret for God, but I want you to know that God was grieved in this way, in the same way that you are grieved when you regret. Okay, this story of Noah is it's quoted 8 times in the New Testament, Noah and the flood. 4 of those in the Gospels, a couple of just genealogy statements, but mainly it's used. Look at, keep a thumb there, we'll come back. Look at Luke 17. Let's look at a couple of these. Luke 17, verse 26. Luke 17, 26. For what? Yeah. Right. Yep. Yeah. Yep. All right. We don't know really, and it depends on a lot of those, how you interpret the genealogies. Are we looking at we know the genealogies are not aimed primarily at giving us every generation that comes, because we see generations skip through the Bible. The point is to get us from one main character to the next, and to be honest with the genealogies. So we don't really know how many when generations were skipped, if they were skipped, who skipped them, and so it's very difficult to say, well, this happened at this time, this happened at this time. You can use the ages of Adam and Noah and kind of get an idea that way, but big picture is we don't know. Conservatively. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Luke 17, 26. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking, marrying, being given in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. That's a nice picture. But this is the same idea. God's judgment on evil is Noah, and so that's used in the New Testament to mean the same thing. I've always thought it was odd, humorous, or at least when somebody first brought it up to me, that like one of the main pictures we have on the walls of our children in their rooms is the flood. And everybody says how happy and the animals are happy. When that's the greatest judgment in the history of the world that we've seen so far, right? There's more deaths in that moment. This is a moment of God's judgment where there are people drowning next to the boat. And we painted on the kids' wall and happily ever after. But it's not a real happy story. It's a rough story. It's a story of evil, but it's a story of God's judgment on evil. It's a story of the first time that God takes action in that way against evil, which he will do forever and will do ultimately in the end, right? Picturing the end in some real sense. And then it's used in 1 Peter 3 as this picture of salvation. Hebrews 11, well, we'll get to that in a second. Okay, second big thing is we see grace for the remnant. We see grace for the remnant. Look at Genesis 6, verse 8. It says, but Noah found, ESV says favor. It's the same word as grace. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. That God shows Noah grace, and so because of that, Noah is chosen to build the ark and all those things that come along with it. Look at Hebrews 11. If you got your Bibles, look at Hebrews 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 7. Hall of Fame of faith. By faith, by faith, by faith. Verse 7 is Noah's turn. It says, by faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So, starting and ending there, by faith. By faith, Noah built an ark. If depending on how you are to take it, took him about 100 years, took him a while of boat building. And then, but because he trusted God so much, his faith in God was so good, so true. He believed what God had told him despite the evidence to the contrary. And so he builds the ark for the saving of his household, etc. The ark there being the thing that saves them, and the ark being a picture of Christ, in many ways, that they are put inside of the ark. The door is closed by God. So in the real sense, they're saved at that moment. When God closes the door, nothing's going to happen to them. And the waters come, the waters of judgment, the waters of chaos come, and the ark floats, and they are saved. Okay, look at chapter 9, Genesis 9. We're not going to do the whole account of the flood. You can read that. I encourage you to do so. But Genesis chapter 9. Verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, every bird of the heavens, everything that creeps in the ground, all the fish. Into your hand they are delivered, every moving thing. And he goes on. We have this sort of recapitulated Garden of Eden. So it's the Garden of Eden again in some sense, that God gives the same commands: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, the new earth in some sense. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the new earth, the charge to do that, and they do. And they do it, by the way. So the next chapter, chapter 10, we won't read, but there's all these nations mentioned, and there's 70 nations in chapter 10 mentioned. Okay, so Noah comes off the ark, be fruitful and multiply. He accomplishes that, and the world is populated. 70 nations mentioned in chapter 10 alone. Again, the aim not being primarily to teach us the history, but to tell us theological things. We go from Noah off the ark to 70 nations in a chapter. Thirdly, maybe the most significant motif in the whole story is this idea of covenant. We first see this sort of language used of covenant. Look at chapter 6 again. Most significant word in all these chapters, probably. Chapter 6, verse 18. God says, I will establish my covenant with you. And you shall come into the ark, you and your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Of every living thing, flesh, you shall bring two, etc., two of this, two of that. So with this first time, we're reading from Genesis for the first time. This is the first time we have this idea of covenant, which is going to be very central to the rest of the Bible, right? This is referred to, and we're very clever in this, but it makes you sound smart, I guess, as the Noahic, or the Noahic covenant. Is this covenant that God makes with Noah, which he is just foreshadowing here, and he actually gives later. Look at chapter 8, verse 20, quickly. Chapter 8, verse 20. First time we have an altar mentioned. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, took some of every clean animal, some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. When the Lord smelled the aroma, said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time, harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. The seasons and all these things will not cease. And God said, chapter 9, be fruitful and multiply. Look down at verse 8 of chapter 9, where you get the fleshing out of the covenant itself, the Noahic covenant. Then God said to Noah and his sons, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, with every living creature, etc. I establish, verse 11, my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I make between me and you and every living creature that's with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, rainbow in the cloud. This shall be a sign of covenant between me and you and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, the bow is seen in the clouds. I'll remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature of flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between me and you. A few things that are really interesting. Normally, and most of the ones we see throughout the rest of the Bible, when we hear the word covenant, it's kind of a two-way thing, right? I make my covenant with you, you make the covenant with me, we agree on certain terms, and the covenant is upheld. The most common covenant we have in the scriptures, at least the kind of category, is called a suzerainty covenant, or suzerain treaty, where you have a bigger kingdom making a treaty with a smaller kingdom. And the smaller kingdom does certain things for the bigger kingdom, say pay taxes or something like that, so that whenever a country is coming to attack the smaller kingdom, the bigger kingdom, they can call upon the name of the suzerain king. That's where we get that language. And that king will come and fight for them, right? There's that kind of covenant, this two-way covenant. They give to them, they protect them. That's how covenants work. This covenant's only one direction. There's never any statements here, like there are later, never any statements here about if you do this, then I won't destroy the earth again with water. All of it is just God. God just keeps saying, I will. Never says if you. There's no if yous. It's just I will. I will do this. I will establish my covenant, the sign of the covenant. And even the rainbow, very interestingly, he says is in some sense mainly for him. I will see it and I will remember all these things. And it's, we don't think about it this way often, but they would have, it seems, that he says if, placing this covenant on himself, saying that I will not do this, I will not do this, and this is a very God thing to do, and we'll see this in a few chapters, is the bow likely represents a bow and arrow that's pointing back towards God, as if to say, if I don't do this, may I be cut. If I don't live up to my end of the covenant, which is the way covenant language is always works. If I don't do this, then may I be like this. We'll see that again in a few chapters very sharply. But the rainbow in the clouds, it's not the idea of a bow, certainly then has this idea of a bow and arrow. And so the idea likely is that God is saying, which he does very clearly later, the bow is at me, and if I don't live up to my covenant, may I be shot. Obviously it's God and all those things, but you get the imagery. God is saying it's on me. If I don't live up to the covenant, it's on me, which he'll do again repeatedly. So we have this purely divine covenant where God says, I will do it, and if I don't live up to the bargain, may I be shot. And there's nothing placed on us. Okay, it's the first sort of graceful covenant that we see. God says, never again will I do that. Never again will I destroy the earth in this manner. And if I were to do so, that the bow is my reminder of this. And then last thing for us to see that's important here in these stories, well, a lot's important, but the main things is sin's persistence. Look at, again, chapter 9. Sin's persistence. So if you're, again, I know it's hard to do that, but imagine you're reading this for the first time, these stories for the first time. You're coming to know about the God of reality and the story of his people and the way he did things. And you have now seen creation. You have seen the sin of Adam and Eve. You have seen sin escalate to murder. You have seen sin lead to death. You have seen the world become so corrupt that every intention of their heart is evil continually. And so God justly and rightly is dealing with sin. Right? And you're reading, and there's a flood now, and God deals with it. And you're thinking, how could the rest of this book be so long? The story's about over. He's dealing with it. Right? He's solving the problem. There's sinners. There's evil. And he deals with it with a flood. End of story. Problem solved. But unfortunately, it's not solved. Look at chapter 9, verse 20. Noah began to be a man of the soil, which there's probably some references there to the curse, that he is working the soil that was cursed, and he's a retraction of those things, which we talked about in chapter 8. And he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And then there's some episode with nakedness, which there's a lot of discussion about what that means, but there's something sexual that happens in the next verses. And we're told immediately as readers, hey, by the way, sin is still there, still a problem, still hasn't been dealt with. No matter how much water God sends on the earth, water is not going to do it. We're going to need something else. No matter how much God does to show to Noah and his people the reality and the weight of sin, we're going to need something else. I mean, think about it. Goodness gracious. So often we think, well, if God would just teach us this and do us this, then we would do right. Really, like Noah just saw the world die because of sin, and then he gets off the boat and sins, like immediately, in multiple ways that we consider at least pretty egregious. And so we're already being told so clearly and so loudly, this isn't going to do it. We're going to need something much more serious to take care of sin. We're going to need something much better and higher and more holy and truer than even just water, even just killing people for their sin and for their evil. Something else is going to have to come. And so already, again, we are being pointed forward to the need of Christ himself. Yep. Let me do 11 quickly. I can do it quickly. Let me do 11 quickly, and I'll be done in like 3 minutes, and I'll be done. Okay, chapter 11 is the last of this section, so let me finish this section. And this is the Tower of Babel, right? You've heard this story, the Tower of Babel. Let's look a little bit just to remind yourself. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Now that's not technically true. Here's how I know that. Look at chapter 10, one chapter earlier. Verse 5. As it's listing all these nations. From these, the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans and their nations. Look at verse 20. These are the sons of Ham, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. Look at verse 31. These are the sons of Shem, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. This is pointing back to what I've kind of been focusing on, at least to some extent the most, in Genesis 1 through 11, is that the point is not primarily to tell you about chronological history the way you would read in a history textbook in your classes today. Right? The point is different than that. The point is theological in nature. And chapter 11 is as well. So does that mean he's lying? Like he just wrote chapter 10. It's not like he's like, oh, I forgot that. Let me make up a new story about them. No, he knows. It's all on purpose. He knows what God, of course, is inspiring all these things. Moses is not dumb as he's writing these things. He knows what he said. So there's the couple of options there are that by whole earth, he means the Mesopotamian world, which the Bible does that often, meaning that the kind of earth that they lived in. Just like if I said, well, the whole earth is this, and just kind of using it as a hyperbolic metaphor. So it could be he's saying the Mesopotamian area itself, or it could just be setting up again this sort of theological truth more than historical one, and making that clear by saying this, right? Because he's just told us about the other languages and things. Regardless, the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick of stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, keywords, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord God came down to see the city and the tower. There's almost a humor there, and scholars agree on this, that when it says the Lord God came down to see the tower, like he couldn't even see it from heaven, it was so small, right? That they had decided to make a tower to heaven, and God says God came down to see it, like he had to come down because he couldn't even see it. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, they have one language. This is only the beginning of what they'll do. Nothing they propose will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. Okay. Again, primarily theological truths here. What we have in this section is blatant arrogance, blatant pride, blatant disobedience of God. Literally, we have the Garden of Eden. We also have it again with Noah, where God says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? Which is a geographical statement. It's go out and fill the earth. They have said instead what we're going to do, right? They say it blatantly. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens. And you see the sin so clearly. Let us, one, make a name for ourselves. Right, there's you a sin. Let us make a name for ourselves, and lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth, which is what they were commanded to do explicitly, to be dispersed in the face of the earth. So we have these people who are building this tower, this ziggurat, this idol is building this thing towards the heavens as if they could do that, right, to reach the heavens with some physical tower, and are in blatant rebellion against God, are displaying their own pride and arrogance, lifting themselves above God and saying, I know God said disperse, but if we do this, we don't have to disperse. We can be God, right? That's what's happening. That's the picture that's being laid out for us by Moses here, by God in chapter 11. It is pride, it is self-exaltation, it is arrogance. That is what occurs at Babel. Direct disregard of God's command. And again, we see the sin of loving human praise, which I know none of you deal with, but I have in my past, not anymore, of course. Love of security, of, well, I'll just build my own little temple, I'll build my own little kingdom, and then I'll be safe. Right? I'll trust in my chariots and in my wealth, and I won't need God. I'll just do my own thing and have all that I need. We see this clear, it's a clear picture of a temple is what's being done. This idea of building something that points to God and that in some sense reaches God, that itself will be the thing that is most meaningful to me. And there's a clear, it's not vague, there's a clear connection between the Tower of Babel and Babylon in the Old Testament and Babylon in the Bible at large, right? You don't have to flip there, you can if you want. In Revelation, you may know, but it's this way in other places as well. But Babylon is used as the prototype of evil, the prototype of arrogance, the prototype of the one who thinks they don't need God. Just like Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon and stood out on his patio and said, look at all the great things I've done, right? Because he was Babylon in the ultimate sense. And we see that played out throughout the Bible. Revelation 17:5, on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the great, mother of prostitutes and earth's abominations. That's on the forehead of one of the beasts, which at least represents great evil and not opposed to God. Its forehead says Babylon, which is it's the same word, right? Babel and Babylon, it's the same word with just a little different suffix like it is in English. Revelation 18, called out with a mighty voice, fallen, fallen is Babylon the great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit and every detestable thing. And there's several of these in Revelation where it's Babylon is the enemy, Babylon is the one God defeats, and it's this picture of the city that thinks it doesn't need God, the city that has put itself as opposed to God. Psalm 137, daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed. Blessed shall he be who repays you. So Babel, this place that is this temple, first time that we hear that word used, it's this arrogance, this self-exaltation, this pride, this disobedience to God, all these things that Babel represents that we see, and that God comes to thwart that, as of course he is going to thwart that ultimately for the rest of the book, right? The rest of the Bible in large part is God defeating Babylon and all that Babylon represents. And then at the end, what's up, Kedrick? How you doing, bro? Look at the end of chapter 11. I told you that whenever you have a genealogy, it's there for a reason, right? It's not accidental, and almost always it's there to connect you from one person to another person, right? And just to show us the historicity of all these things, to connect us from a main character to a main character. And here we're being connected to Abraham, of course, as we're about to start chapter 12, which is Abraham. Verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. After you get all the generations above that, Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran, and Haran fathered Lot. And so we're connected to Abram and Lot. Down to verse 31. Terah took Abram his son, Lot the son of Haran his grandson, Sarah or Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. First time we hear Canaan mentioned. Right, first time we hear the land of Canaan, the promised land, the place Israel would be given, the place God was about to promise to Abraham in a couple of chapters. Right, we hear this land of Canaan, and it says they're heading that direction. They don't get there, right? They settle before that, but they're heading towards Canaan. And so it seems like Augustine's two great cities that we have presented here, two great cities in chapter 11. We have Canaan, which is the arrogance and the rebellion against God and the self-exaltation and the disobedience. And then we have the first mention of the promised land, which is the land of Canaan, which of course is the land that will be used to first foreshadow the church first and heaven. Eventually, it's the promised land of God, the place where God's people would live, which was a physical land, of course, but more importantly, it was pointing to the spiritual land of God's people and the faith of Abraham and all these things. And so we have this in chapter 11 where there's this juxtaposition, it seems, between the picture of arrogance and the picture of submission to God, the picture of rebellion and the picture of humility and the people of God. Those against God and saying we're going to build our own tower, our own ziggurat. We're going to make a name for ourselves, and those who say we're going to make a name for God. We're going to bow to God. And so we're already seeing the saved and the lost, this clear dichotomy between the two in these cities, it seems. Okay, perfect, 7:15. Thoughts, questions on any of that? And then you'll be dismissed and we'll do Q&A for any of that stuff. Gregory, this better be I'm teaching you something and not asking me a question. No, I mean you teaching me something, not me teaching you something. Yeah. Yeah, right. The whole thing, and it just kind of goes back in time. Yeah, thank you for that. That's certainly true. Certainly a possibility. That's the case. Yeah, that's a good point. What else? Like that's ever stopped us here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, in chapter 4, yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. I'm pretty sure, and Greg, you may know better than me. I'm pretty sure that the traditional understanding is it's a different Lamech. That it was a not the same individual, but it's possible, and the Bible does speak that way at times that he was in them in some sense, right? It talks about that with somebody in Hebrews, but there's a picture of us that we're in Christ in the same way that. Yeah, but I think the traditional understanding is a different Lamech. So the Lamech in chapter 4, who is a bit of a problem, bit of a murderer, is not traditionally understood to be the father of Noah, or the father of Noah. Yeah, yeah. Any thoughts or additions on that? And of course, just like last thing I'll say, very interestingly, one of the main ways that archaeologists will date certain things is this is very interesting to me, is the names that names are incredibly time specific. So like you can go back through time and say if this name is being used, it's almost certainly being placed in this time period. That we all tend to use the same names, right? And we can see that today. There's a lot of Matthews and there's a lot of Jameses and there's a lot of Johns and it hasn't always been the case that was true. And so like when archaeologists will find stuff, one of the ways they'll use to date the thing is to see what names are on the thing, like on the tablet. And that'll be one of the pieces of evidence that says, well, these names were most common in this time period. And Lamech, the same thing could be true in the Old Testament times, of course, that there were common names that were used more than once, just like there were in the New Testament as well. So it's not a stretch to think that they're different at all.